Welcome back to a brand new edition of Bonsai-U. In this episode, we're going to be working on one of the most iconic trees here at Eisei-en, this large Rocky Mountain Juniper. Now my guess is that a majority of you watching this video have actually seen this tree somewhere on the internet before. I initially designed and styled this tree for my online advanced bonsai course with Bonsai Empire a couple years back. So I'll put a link in the description down below so you can check that out to see the process of how I decided what the front of the tree was going to be, what the angle of the tree would be, and how to actually place and design the branches. Everything from raffia application to separating live wood from dead wood to be able to manipulate branches into place, and then the initial branch setting on this tree. Now you'll notice from that original video with the online advanced course at Bonsai Empire to what you see right here, a big change has occurred with this tree. Actually, several big changes have occurred. So first and foremost, we were able to move it from that wooden box that it was in to this nice Japanese tokoname container. Now I actually potted this tree in this container just a little over a year ago, so actually in August, late August of 2018. Now the reason that I potted it that time of year, which is not really the best time of year to pot trees up, was because the wooden container had deteriorated to such a degree by that time that it was completely falling apart and the tree desperately needed to be transplanted. So I took the tree out of that wooden box, slip potted it into this container, which happened to fit perfectly. Didn't really have to do much in terms of root work on the tree, but I did retain a lot of the original soil, which in this case was actually pure pumice. That's what it had been planted in right after it was collected in Wyoming a few years back by the guys at BACKCOUNTRY Bonsai. And again, I'm going to put a link to their stuff down in the description down below so you can check their website out as well. But it was originally in pumice, slipped it into this pot right here, keeping a majority of that original pumice there. So this is actually technically not bonsai soil mix, or what I would normally plant a Rocky Mountain juniper or any conifer in when I transition it to a bonsai pot. I would normally do 1 part akadama, 1 part lava rock, and 1 part pumice. But again, because of the timing that this tree had to be repotted into this pot, I just retained a majority of that pumice so I didn't have to work the roots too much, slipped it in here and then backfilled it just a little bit with that original pumice. So as you can see, it acclimated just fine to that. We went through that following winter, then through a growing season this year, and you can see that the tree has really filled out in the interim. It also looks very unkempt at this point, and that's because about 2 weeks ago, one of our students here at the intensive courses at Eisei-en took the wire off of this tree for me, and he actually cleaned up the live vein and the dead wood as well. Now, if you want to see the full process on how to clean live veins, clean dead wood, definitely check out my online courses with Bonsai Empire. All of that information is featured there. But with the wire having come off the tree, you'll notice that it's really full. There's a lot of sort of flopping branches, floppy foliage going on here. So the goal in this particular episode of Bonsai-U is to take this tree to the next step in its refinement. So what we're going to be doing is a little bit of detail wiring, removing unnecessary foliage, trying to retain as much foliage as possible though, because my goal is to put this tree in the US National Show in about a year from now. So I don't want to make it too sparse, mainly for the show, but also because I don't want it to revert again to juvenile foliage. We're starting to get a reversion back to adult foliage finally after 2 years of styling. So I don't want to set the tree back again by cutting off too much foliage and scaring the tree into producing juvenile foliage once again. So the first step in the process though, before we jump into wiring and styling the branches, is going to be to paint the dead wood with lime sulfur to turn it a bit more of a whitish color. So I'm going to use a mix of 50% water, 50% lime sulfur. And when I apply lime sulfur to a trunk like this, I don't want the trunk to be bone dry and I don't want it to be overly wet either. In both of those cases, when you paint the lime sulfur on, it'll quite often run off. It won't absorb very well and you'll end up making a giant mess without turning the dead wood that desired white color. So in order to make sure that the lime sulfur actually does absorb into the wood and turns it that nice bright white color, what I'm going to do is, as I'm painting that 50% water, 50% lime sulfur mixture onto the trunk, just before I paint it on, I'll spritz the trunk with a little bit of water. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it does allow the lime sulfur to actually absorb into the wood and turn that wood almost instantaneously white. So we're going to do that first, and then after that we're going to get into styling and wiring the branches on the tree. All right, so as you can see, we've got the lime sulfur painted on. There's still a few spots that appear to be yellow, but those will fade a little bit over time. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that this bright white color is not exactly the ideal aesthetic, in my opinion, for a tree this large. So over the next couple of weeks, as this color starts to fade a little bit further back to that grayish color, I think it's going to give it a more natural color. Now, as a general rule of thumb, the aesthetic preference in Japan is that the smaller the tree, the smaller the juniper, for example, in an exhibition, the more contrast you want to have between the live wood and the dead wood. The idea being that those smaller trees tend to get swallowed up by the larger trees in the exhibition. So in order to make those pop and stand out more, you want that nice bright contrast. Now, of course, the larger the tree that you have, the less you need that contrast to really make the tree pop, because the size of the tree takes care of that. So in the case of this tree, like I said, as it fades over the next couple of weeks, I think it's going to look a little bit more natural, more aesthetically pleasing. But this is a necessary evil at least once a year, if not twice a year, particularly if you live in a humid environment like here in Nashville, Tennessee, to clean and paint the dead wood with that lime sulfur to help preserve it and to eliminate that fungus, and of course to give it a little bit more of a white color. Now, the next step with this tree is going to be to work on the foliage on the plant. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this tutorial, we're not going to be removing too much foliage because I don't want the tree to again revert to juvenile foliage. Now, just as an explanation here, juvenile foliage is essentially that spiky foliage that's produced by certain species of junipers when they get overly pruned or when they get overly stressed. Now, this is said to be an evolutionary response in the tree. So essentially, a tree that exists in the mountains, like this one, for example, when it was growing in the mountains for 350, 400 years, if an animal came by and ate that nice adult soft foliage, the scale-like foliage on the tree would then produce that spiky juvenile foliage in response to that, so that the animal would feel less desire to go back and eat on that tree once again. Another theory that I've heard, or hypothesis that I've heard, is that the actual photosynthetic surface of that juvenile foliage tends to be a bit larger than the scale-like foliage. Even if it's minimal, it still is larger. So if a tree has too much foliage eaten off of it, for example, by an animal, or if something comes along like a big wind gust comes along and rips a lot of foliage off the trees, it will then produce that juvenile foliage, which has that larger surface area to that new spiky foliage, which can then produce more food for the plant, keep it alive, keep it healthy. Regardless, in bonsai culture, that juvenile foliage is not really the most desirable type of foliage to have on a juniper, particularly if the original adult foliage is that nice scale foliage. So like on a Rocky, for example, or on a Kishu from Japan, Itoigawa, for example, from Japan, those are all scale foliage junipers that will revert to juvenile foliage if overly pruned or overly stressed. So anytime that you produce juvenile foliage on a scale like juniper like this, the only thing you can do is wait for that juvenile foliage to revert back to adult foliage from the tip. So in other words, if you get a lot of juvenile foliage on a juniper like this, just don't prune it. Let it grow back, let it grow naturally, and eventually that juvenile foliage will then revert to adult foliage from the tip out. So as you can see, a majority of the foliage on this tree has started to revert back to that adult foliage at the tip, which is great. So I don't want to remove more than about 20% of the growth total on this tree so that we can prevent it from again reverting back to juvenile foliage. So the types of foliage we're going to be cutting off this tree are going to be crotch growth, for example. So in the bifurcations of the branches, any of that growth coming out of the crotch further back in, I'm going to remove that so we can see the nice structure of the branches, that nice bifurcating branch structure that I've been working on for the last couple of years. The second type of growth we're going to be taking off is any growth that's dangling off the bottom of a branch. Now keep in mind, when you're working with juniper branches, you can actually flip them 180 degrees. So if a majority of the foliage is dangling on the bottom, and by removing that, all you leave is a little tuft of foliage at the end, well, that's not really an ideal situation either. So what you can do in that case is actually rotate the whole branch 180 degrees, so all of that foliage that was on the bottom is now oriented on top. So you're not taking off too much foliage and again having reversion to juvenile foliage. So just one special little trick there to give you a more refined look and to allow you to keep more foliage on a juniper. It also works well for pines too. So That's the second type of growth we're going to be taking off. We're also going to be looking at any heavy upward growth coming out of our lateral branches. Now this tree, we've maintained it relatively well over the last few years, the last 2 years. So there really aren't any heavy upward branches. So I don't think we're going to have to cut that type of growth off, but keep that in mind when you're working on your own material. Doesn't matter what species it is, that's one of those objective types of growth that you can cut off of any tree. The reason being is that that upward growth tends to be much stronger than the lateral growth because a majority of the plants we work with are apically dominant. So the apex is stronger than the lower branches and the upward growth is stronger than the lateral branches. So by removing those upward growing branches, we can promote the growth of the lateral branches, which is what we want. We want those branches dropped and down into position. So that's a third type of growth we're going to be removing on this tree. So let's dive into pruning this plant, and then we're going to talk about wiring and branch placement. Okay, now that we've thinned out this Rocky Mountain juniper, we can start the wiring process. Before we jump into that, I want to explain a little bit about what happened to this tree in the last couple of years since its initial styling for our online course. Now, when I initially styled this tree, I did it in a manner where it was moving to the right. So the directionality of the tree was to the right, meaning that the first directional branch was moving to the right as well. Well, that first directional branch actually protruded just underneath this big bend in the trunk right here. Now, after I placed that branch and styled it over the course of the subsequent winter, that branch slowly faded and died out. That could have been because it was overworked. It could have been that it got somewhat of a fungal issue and that branch died off as a result of that. But regardless, it's no longer there. So what I did in the second year, I restyled this tree once more. In the second year, I actually built it with the tree moving back to the left by utilizing these branches here as they elongated as essentially the directional branch on the tree. So this tree is one of those sort of anomalous trees where it's a bit ambiguous when you set it down and look at it as to whether or not it moves to the right or moves to the left, because you've got this big gin that's sticking out of the bottom here. This was actually originally a root on the tree. As a matter of fact, this tree, when it was collected out of the mountains, it was lying flat. So this back side of the tree was lying down against the boulder, which is why the live vein is underneath here. That was protected by the dead wood on the top from the elements. So this was actually a root that protruded out in a different direction, died off slowly, and became what you see here, this piece of dead wood. And of course, the upper branch right here, or the upper gin, was a branch in nature that died back over time. So you get this really interesting kind of zigzag, almost lightning bolt look to the tree. But the length of this gin down here and the length of the gin up at the top over here are about the same length. So in terms of the actual directionality of the tree, just based on the movement of the trunk and these gins, it could go either direction. So the foliage mass is what really indicates what the directionality of the tree is. So again, in this case, I designed it moving to the right because a lot of that mass is on the right side there, particularly in the upper portion of the tree here. But because that died off and this elongated over time, we actually redesigned it, or I redesigned it here with this as a directional branch moving back to the left. So when we get done designing this tree this time around, I am going to keep this as it is here, right in front of the trunk, as a potential directional branch. But when we finish the actual setting of the branches, I'm going to put it in the tokonoma. We're going to set it up on both the right side and the left side of the tokonoma with an accent on either side so you can see which one looks the best. And then, of course, I'll get you guys to comment in the comments down below and let me know which direction you think suits this tree best. But first things first, what we're going to do is get some wire on the lower branches here, this branch down here that's closest to the trunk. We're going to start with that, position this, and work our way towards the top. So you can see on the back side of the tree here, this is the branch that was split away from the deadwood during the online bonsai course with Bonsai Empire. You can see that it did survive. It's looking a-okay down here. The only problem is when we separated it, the actual live vein that was feeding this branch right here was very, very, very thin. So there's not a lot of connection up here at the top. So it's a little bit floppy. It has stiffened up to some degree since we separated the live vein from the deadwood, but it is still slightly floppy. So just to make sure that it doesn't tear away or break up here at the top, I'm gonna put a piece of wire with rubber on it wrapped around right at the base here to make sure, again, that it doesn't tear away. So we're gonna put that on there first, and then I'm gonna come out to the end here. We're gonna wire this branch and use a small guy wire to pull this up into position. All right, now that we've got that brace on up at the top there, we can start working on wiring the branch from here out. Now, as I mentioned before, the branch is a little bit floppy, so we are going to be putting a guy wire to pull this up and around, but I don't think we necessarily need to put a very thick piece of wire on from the base out to the end for support. It's well supported with that brace up at the top for right now, so we can actually start from this next bifurcation and work our way out. So for a branch this size, I'm really just working with sizes 14, 16, and 18 with copper wire. Typically, I don't go as far down as size 20 unless I need it for a guy wire, for example, so we may very well use a size 20 for this to pull it up and around. But in terms of the wrapped wire on the branch, all I'm going to be working with here are sizes 14, 16, and 18. So we're going to start with size 14 here first. Now you'll notice that there's a little bit of wire scarring on this branch right here. I want to make sure that I'm going the same direction as the wire scar with this new wire. That doesn't mean I want to put it in the same groove, but I want to go in the same direction. So this wire was going counterclockwise, so I want to make sure that the new wire that we're putting on is also going counterclockwise. The reason being is that this has already scarred the branch right here, so if we go the opposite direction of that and it happens to bite into the branch again, it'll kill the branch. If we go the same direction and it bites in again, it's very unlikely or less likely to kill that branch. So in that case, I want to make sure that we're going to start on this branch going counterclockwise here, which means the other branch over here is going to end up going clockwise. So because this branch over here is a little bit thicker, I'm going to go ahead and get our anchor on there first, and then we'll come out onto this branch here. And again, I don't want to go in the original groove, I want to go along the side of that groove. Now when we get to the first split here, the first bifurcation in the branch, I'm going to take this wire out onto typically the thickest of the two, which in this case is the one on the left right here. So I'm going to take this wire out directly onto this branch. Now technically here, I really only need to go about 2 rotations or 2 wraps past this first bifurcation. Then I can go back with a smaller wire and work from here out. And these 2 wraps here will actually serve as the anchor for both branches. But because I have a little bit longer wire here, I'm going to take it a couple extra wraps further out. But just keep that in mind. As long as you go at least 2 wraps past each bifurcation, that'll give you enough of an anchor point there. All right, let's take this wire out on the other side here. All right, now we're going to come back to that second bifurcation and work our way out from there. So this is a little bit thinner than the original branch here, so we don't need to use that size 14. We're going to drop it down to a size 16. And again, I'm using copper wire on this tree, and that's typical with most coniferous material. All right, so I've got the anchor on here. Now we've gotten to that last bifurcation here where it splits again. So again, as long as I take this wire a couple of wraps past this split, it doesn't matter which side I go on, as long as I take it at least a couple of wraps past that split, we can then go back with a smaller wire and wire from here to the other tip, and that will complete the wiring for this branch. Okay, and for the last wire that goes on here, we're going to use a size 18. So we're going to take it from this to the final tip that I have over here, and that will complete the wiring for this section of this back branch here. Again, you want to make sure that you're putting the anchor on the branch that already has the original wire on it first here, so that it doesn't teeter-totter when you wire that secondary branch. All right, I'm going to take this all the way out to the very tip here. And as we get to the end, I'm going to try to weave that wire in between the foliage. Don't want to crush the foliage together. And then at the end, I'm going to put a loop so that when we drop this branch into position, I can lift the tips up and put them exactly where I want them to go. Just like this, right here. All right, and now we can create a very refined look to this branch. All right, and if you want to get an extra refined look, you can remove some more of that foliage off the bottom there once you actually position the branch in the right spot. So now that we've got the lower branches set on the tree, we can now work on the apex of the tree here. Now, if you look back to how this was styled back in 2017, the first time around, the apex actually had a really low profile to it. Well, of course, over time, it's grown out and extended, so it's a little bit taller through this area, which I actually like. So in redesigning this apex or in rewiring this apex this time around, what I don't want to do is crush that profile back down again. I want to keep sort of this nice rounded top to the tree. So we're going to place wire on most of the branches up here, but I'm not going to drop it down significantly. We're probably going to lose maybe 1 inch to 2 inches in height on the apex, which is pretty minimal, but I basically want it to sit just underneath this gin to the rear right here, so that this kind of mimics the line of the gin. You get a nice picture frame over the apex with that gin to the rear. So let's get some wire on the apex. Okay, so as you can see, I've completed the wiring and detail styling process on this tree. Now again, this is the third iteration of this since its original styling in 2017. And I think it's come quite a long way in that short 2-year period. Now again, the goal is going to be to put this tree in the US National Show in a few months from now. So we're going to maintain this well over the next few months, fertilizing it very mildly to make sure it doesn't put on too much growth, and then pruning at the optimal time to get back budding, to get those pads to fill in a little bit more. And of course, we're going to be covering the soil surface with moss in preparation for the exhibition. But for the time being, the tree is going to go back out into the garden. And now that we're sort of in the middle of winter right now, it's going to go onto the ground and be healed in for the remainder of the winter season. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, what I want to do now is actually put it in the tokonoma before we take it back outside and see which direction makes sense for this tree, because again, it's somewhat ambiguous. Could be moving to the right, could be moving to the left. So let's put it in the tokonoma and see what we come up with. So when you put the tree in the tokonoma, it looks completely different than having it on the turntable while you're working on it. It gives you a totally different sense of the tree, a total different understanding of the directionality of the tree. And in my opinion, it's the perfect setup for displaying a bonsai, which is why it's the traditional way of doing it in Japan. Now, for me personally, I like one of these directions more than the other, but I want to hear what you guys think down in the comments down below. And then maybe in a future episode or next year when we put it in the national show, I'll do a video about this tree and you'll see which one of those two directions I prefer myself. So you'll have to stay tuned until then to see what the final decision is. But in any case, I want to thank you guys for checking out this episode of Bonsai-U. And if you really like what we do here, make sure to like and subscribe down below. And if you really want to support us going forward, you can jump over to our website. I'll put a link in the description down below, and you can make a monetary donation to help keep this platform going into the future. Until the next episode though, take care and we'll see you guys next time.